Hello, welcome to today's webinar on the federal budget process. I hope our next few minutes together will help clarify how the federal budget process works. So many of you heard or read about the recent release of the President's budget request for fiscal year 2026. And while there are many different important reasons why that event is notable, one of the reasons why this is an important event is because the president's budget request to Congress is what kicks off the annual appropriations process on Capitol Hill. So perhaps I should provide a quick illustration of how the process works at a high level, and then I'll come back and talk about specific details within the process. So the president submits his budget request to Congress, and then members of the House and Senate Appropriations committees will take that budget request and use it as a starting point for the drafting of the various different appropriation bills that are required to fund all federal agencies. So once Congress passes those various different appropriation bills, they get sent over to the White House for the president's signature. But the process doesn't end there. Once the president signs each appropriation bill, the president then sends the appropriation measure over to the Office of Management and Budget. OMB sits within the White House. OMB officials work at the new executive office building, which is directly across the street from the White House. And so it's OMB's role to then take that appropriation bill and allocate funds to the various different federal agencies within the administrative branch based on the directive provided by Congress in each of the appropriation measures. So let me go back to the president's budget submission to Congress. As I said, the president submits his budget request to Congress. That kicks off the annual appropriations process. House and Senate appropriators will typically take that budget request and use it as a starting point as they begin to draft their various different appropriation measures. While the president, I should say, is finalizing his budget request to Congress, there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes as appropriators prepare to start drafting the various different appropriation bills within their jurisdiction. And so, obviously, if you're a member of the House and Senate Appropriations Committee, if you're a congressional appropriator, you are uniquely positioned to influence the allocation of not only federal dollars to various different agencies, but also to influence the allocation of federal dollars to your state or to the congressional district that you represent. Now, if you're not a member of the House or Senate Appropriations Committee, this is an important perk for all members of Congress. So even if you're not an appropriator, you have the ability to submit a list of your funding priorities to the House or Senate Appropriations Committee for their consideration as they begin to draft their appropriation bills. And so if you're member X from X state, you have a list of 10, 15, 20 different priorities you want to submit to the Appropriations Committee. And so you know that there are a handful of needs that your district or that your state has. Your district or your state might need a new hospital. They might need a new post office, new roads, new bridges. And so those are part of what you're requesting that appropriators fund. But in addition to those more parochial needs, you may also have broader funding requests across federal agencies that aren't specific to your state or to your congressional district. And so for those broader funding needs, you also know that if you can get 5, 10, 15, 20, or more other members of Congress to submit that same request, then that request is going to carry more weight with appropriators as they start drafting their bills. So, one opportunity members of Congress have is to circulate letters to their colleagues. This is what we've been calling the Dear Colleague letters. So, as a member of Congress, you have an opportunity to circulate a letter to your colleagues stating that you would like appropriators to provide, in our case, a robust investment in the CDC Injury Center as they draft their respective fiscal year 2026 appropriation bills. And so you draft this letter and you circulate it to your colleagues because you know that the more members of Congress that sign on to your letter expressing support for that specific funding request, the greater weight that funding request will carry with appropriators. And so that is why we work with our champions in the House and the Senate on an annual basis to circulate a letter in each chamber aimed at building support for funding allocations to the CDC Injury Center. As the president is finalizing his budget request for submission to Congress, there is early work happening behind the scenes on Capitol Hill that informs or will influence how appropriators will draft these appropriation measures, which is why it's so important for us to work with our members, to work with those in the injury and violence prevention community to do everything possible to encourage members of Congress to sign on to these House and Senate Dear Colleague letters. In addition to the Dear Colleague letters, members of Congress have the unique ability to provide their own funding requests to House and Senate appropriators. And this year, the House and Senate Appropriations Committee set May 23rd as the deadline by when they had to receive the various different funding requests that members were submitting. So we're now past the deadline for funding requests. And so in the weeks and months ahead, appropriators will turn their attention to drafting, as I said, the various different appropriation bills that are required in order to fund all federal government agencies. The appropriation bill that we work to influence is the appropriation bill for the Departments of Labor, Health and Human Services, and Education. Why? Because that's the appropriation bill that carries the budget for the CDC, and more specifically, the budget for the CDC National Center for Injury Prevention and Control. Now, you can imagine, and this is exactly what happens, right? So there are three very important inputs that appropriators receive that informs how they draft their bills. One is the president's budget request. The second is the Dear Colleague letters. And the third is the list of individual member funding requests that members submit to the committee. So you can imagine this large Excel spreadsheet that contains all the various different funding requests that they've received. And so appropriators look to see where there is broad support for specific initiatives, specific programs for specific agencies. And that's where they work to try to meet the funding requests that they have received. Why? Because at the end of the day, appropriators know that they need to draft bills that will pass the floor of the Senate and the floor of the House. So they know that if they meet the funding requests that they've received from a majority of their colleagues, then chances are those colleagues are going to vote for the bill. And so they will have drafted a bill that will be able to pass, as I said, on the floor of the House or on the floor of the Senate. So as we turn our attention to the weeks and months ahead, again, if you're member X from state X, you've already submitted your funding priorities to the appropriators. You've already circulated your Dear Colleague letter. You've signed on to a handful of Dear Colleague letters. But you know that you have a handful of top funding priorities. And so as the summer progresses, you're up on Capitol Hill, you're voting on bills, you're going to committee hearings, you're going to lunches. Both parties have their weekly caucus lunches. So you're always interacting with your colleagues on Capitol Hill. And as you know that the appropriations process is advancing, you will absolutely reach out to those appropriators who you sit next to during lunch, or those appropriators who you see at your committee hearings. And you will nudge them in the weeks and months ahead by saying, I submitted this funding request for this program, and I just want you to know that my constituents are still contacting me about their interest in this program. My constituents are still reaching out to me to ask to meet with me or my staff about this program. So I want you to know that this is still very important to me, and my constituents are watching. My constituents continue to tell me I have to do everything I can to get this program funded. And that is why we will be making a concerted push with our members, with those in the injury and violence prevention community, to encourage that everyone connect with their lawmakers while they're back home during the August congressional recess, because we have to do everything possible in order to keep injury and violence prevention programs at the forefront for these members of Congress. When these lawmakers go back home for the August congressional recess, they're spending the vast majority of their time out in the communities that they represent, talking with voters, meeting with constituents, hearing from them what's on their minds, what's important to them. And we need to make sure that as that process unfolds, members of Congress are still hearing about the importance of injury and violence prevention programs. If they're not hearing about these programs from their constituents, these programs are likely to fall down on their list of priorities. We will have more information in the weeks ahead aimed at helping you engage with your lawmakers during the August congressional recess, as I said, to ensure that we all collectively work to keep injury and violence prevention needs at the forefront for members of Congress. At the end of the summer, at some point, we will have an opportunity to see the draft bills that the House and Senate Appropriations Committees have pulled together for the Departments of Labor, Health and Human Services, and Education. And that will give us our first glimpse, our first signal with regards to what appropriators are willing to fund at the CDC Injury Center. There's been a lot of focus, a lot of attention, a lot of discussion about this HHS reorganization and the move of a handful of CDC Injury Center programs over to a new administration for a healthy America. And that is something that appropriators will have to grapple with. That is something that appropriators will have to determine if they support moving these programs over to this new AHA agency, or if they would rather keep these programs at the CDC Injury Center in Atlanta. So there are a lot of moving parts. There are a lot of opportunities to influence how these discussions progress, how these bills get drafted. But at the end of the day, it is critically important that constituents, that our members, that, as I said, those in the injury and violence prevention arena work to keep injury and violence prevention issues top of mind for members of Congress in the House and in the Senate. So I hope this has been informative. I hope this helps clarify how the budget process works and the need for injury and violence prevention professionals to engage in the policymaking process. Thank you.